When I was 12 years old, I had a best friend named Brenda. We always walked home together after school. She lived in a big house on the edge of town. One day, Brenda didn't show up for school, and she was gone for days on end. I began to worry about what had happened to her. A whole week went by, but she still didn't show up, so I decided to go visit her. I walked across town and got to her house just in time for dusk. I rang the doorbell and was startled when it opened almost immediately. Brenda's mom stood on the doorstep, but there was something strange about her appearance. She looked darker than usual. Her hair was disheveled and hung down over her shoulders. I noticed she was wearing a robe, but the most frightening thing was her smile. She didn't say a word, just stood there looking at me. Her unnatural smile, as if playing on her lips, unnerved me. I asked if Brenda was home, and she gestured for me to come in without making a sound. Before I could say anything, she was out the door. When I stepped inside, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, but I couldn't see where she'd gone. At that moment, I heard a strange chewing sound coming from the kitchen, and I headed over there. She was standing at the kitchen sink with her back to me. As soon as I entered the kitchen, she stopped making those noises, and there was an ominous silence. I sat down at the kitchen table and began to wait. She didn't move, as if her whole body was motionless. She stood with her back to me for a full 5 minutes, and I just sat and watched. At some point, I realized that all this time she still hadn't moved. Her arms were down along her body and her head was tilted slightly. There was something completely unnatural about her posture. I stood up and nervously walked over to her. She still remained perfectly still. I walked around her to look into her face and make sure she was okay. What I saw still haunts me to this day. Her eyes were wide open and there was a sinister smile on her face. I was so scared that I couldn't stay in the kitchen a second longer, running out of there without a word. The next day, I was informed that Brenda was absent from school because there had been a tragedy in her family. My parents told me the news that made my hair stand on end. I cried with fear for days. They told me that Brenda's mom had died unexpectedly the night I arrived at their house. At that moment, Brenda was at her grandparents' house making funeral arrangements. A chilling horror gripped me. If they were preparing for a funeral elsewhere, who was in their apartment then?